Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this public lecture that is put on by USC's Society of Fellows in the Humanities and the Sites of Inquiry Research Group. The Society of Fellows is this fantastic institution that brings together an interdisciplinary set of scholars in the humanities around a single topic of focus, which this year is sites of inquiry. So we're thinking about spaces and places of knowledge production with a group of scholars, faculty, postdocs, and graduate students that range from classics to history and art history and musicology to studying the Soviet Union to the Panama Canal. And we're very happy to sponsor this lecture by Susan Zieger from the University of California, Riverside. The talk is based on her book, which just came out. That's called Logistics and Power: Supply Chains from Slavery to Space. And as you'll see, it's a very ambitious and wide-ranging book that thinks about the ways that logistics has made the world around us. And I think for me at least, this was the kind of attractiveness of the book for the Sites of Inquiry research group, that it's really thinking about knowledge production about the world as a place where logistics happen, where things are, goods and people are moved around at a really global scale. So it's a book that thinks about technology, about administration, about mobility, about automation, but it's also a deeply human book, and as you'll hear, that really thinks about the human experiences in the middle of all of these supply chains. So Professor Zieger is a professor of English literature at the University of California, Riverside. She has her BA from Dartmouth, her Masters of Science in the History of Science, Medicine, and Technology from Imperial College in the UK, and her PhD from UC Berkeley. She is the author of Inventing the Addict, Drugs, Race, and Sexuality in 19th Century British and American Literature, The Mediated Mind, Affect, Ephemera, and Consumerism in the 19th Century, and now most recently of Logistics and Power, the book on which this talk is based. So without further ado, I hand it over to Susan for her talk, and then we get to ask questions and enjoy coffee.
Thank you so much. I think I'm absolutely happy if people who are in the hall want to sit on the floor. There's floor space here for maybe 3 people. I don't mind. I'll try to project. Can you hear me in the hall? Okay. All right. So thank you, Arrow, for that wonderful introduction, and Nancy as well for hosting my visit, and the Society of Fellows and the History Department, and the graduate students whose seminar I just sat in on, and all of you, each of you, for being here. Obviously, everyone has other things that they could be doing, so I am grateful that you're here, and I hope to make it worthwhile. All right. So, criminal supply chains and logistical power. I wasn't a killer. I wasn't a bad guy. I was a businessman. Everybody gets into the business to make money. Nobody gets into the business to kill people. What kept me alive was my ability to turn a profit for everyone. It wasn't a gun in my pocket. It wasn't that I had 50 armed guys. It wasn't that I was a badass motherfucking killer. It was my ability to get shit from point A to point B. Luis Navia spent 25 years as a cocaine logistician for Colombian and Mexican drug trafficking organizations until his 2000 arrest in Venezuela. Having served reduced time for cooperation, he opened a construction business in Miami in 2005 and still consults with U.S. anti-narcotics officers. Navia represents the professionalization of the illegal drug operation. He's not a fabled criminal patriarch such as El Chapo or Pablo Escobar, but a pragmatic technical person who can securely move the product and seal the deal. Another anonymous cocaine logistician similarly presented himself as an outsider to the traditional Italian criminal clans. As he put it, quote, "People like us don't grow in a family. We're entrepreneurs, independent minds. For the important operations, you need the ability to plan and also the ability to improvise. We're no different from the best business managers, only a bit better because of the additional difficulties we have to cope with," end quote. In these self-portraits, the cocaine trafficker is a supply chain manager, a supremely agile organizer, an innovator beholden foremost to his art and science of moving contraband goods in secret. Not the cold-blooded enforcer, but the technical nerd is the true renegade, the logistician's logistician. To deliver illegal goods, they constantly devise new methods and take huge risks, reaping enormous windfalls. Some have MBAs and appear like legitimate corporate managers. Meanwhile, ordinary managers operate like criminals. As customs specialist Alan Hall put it, "You want to know who most commonly breaks the law? Who is the prototypical smuggler? It's a nice, educated, well-dressed, mid-level corporate manager selling respectable commodities. He knows if he cooks the customs forms a bit to avoid tariffs, inspections, and delays, he increases sales, profits, and efficiency for his company," end quote. So while we might assume that there's a world of difference between smuggling drugs and avoidance of minor regulations, I'm actually arguing against the grain of that conventional wisdom in order to highlight how logistical power works. Logistics is the efficient movement of goods, people, and information to optimize capital. And it expresses logistical power, the set of forceful strategies by which capitalist and military groups attempt to control the modern supply chain world. It is a simple, almost obvious mode of power that accrues to those who can be first or fastest to market, gain a monopoly, or control access to a territory. Logistical power reveals how much the legitimate economy overlaps with the clandestine one. Godfather of neoliberal economics, Milton Friedman, was blithe about it, describing illegal markets as a way of getting around government controls and enabling the free market to work. Political calls for freer trade seek to expand the movement of merchandise at the lowest possible cost, a bottom line that prompts tax evasion, worker exploitation, and environmental violations. In industrializing Europe, the 18th century heyday of smuggling waned when the 19th century era of laissez-faire waxed, suggesting that smuggling is the extreme or truly free version of free trade. At present, 2/3 of all trade moves outside legal channels, and up to 90% of trade violates accepted regulation. It ranges from manipulated labels and double financing to violating sanctions and trafficking hazardous waste and beyond. This lawlessness suggests two aspects of logistics' power to defy political will: its brute capacity to move goods around the world and its ability to conceal that movement from the authorities. We can see both aspects of logistical power in Italian journalist Luca Rostello's 2011 book, I Am the Market: How to Smuggle Cocaine by the Ton in 5 Easy Lessons, a compendium of bleakly comic advice for the budding criminal logistician and a satire on self-entrepreneurship in our post-organization economy. Rostello's jocular narrator, a composite of drug logisticians that he interviewed, described how he moved drugs by the ton in shipping containers, using the legal economy as his carrier. Disguised by the surrounding welter of canned foods, toys, clothes, toiletries, and all the other stuff that counts for 90% of everything, which is the volume of trade that is carried by container, drugs and other illegal goods glide into ports, flow along roads, and may even slide unnoticed into your own kitchen, closet, or garage. Drug logisticians also employ human mules, but in the 2000s they scaled up, hiding cocaine and heroin in shipments of branded items and moving them under the cover of recognizable, trustworthy brand names such as Fiat and Dole. In the 2010s and 20s, the logistical techniques for speeding the flow of illegal trade, e-commerce, free trade zones, the rise in small parcel volume, also juiced the counterfeit economy, moving it to established brick and mortar chains and online platforms. The foundation was laid in the 80s and 90s by the neoliberal turn to informal networking and free trade agreements. After several decades of intensification, there is little real or political or corporate will to enhance monitoring and pursue prosecution because truly fighting clandestine economies would also hamper legal trade. A business culture that favors freer markets, deregulation, and subcontracting creates permissive conditions for organized crime to flourish. This situation gives a free hand to logistical power, asking in return only that it periodically stage performative drug busts to persuade everyone to look the other way. So with rare exceptions, legitimate and criminal economies use the same means to transport goods. Since subcontracted assembly increasingly takes place in transit, with parts, materials, and ingredients combining in different locations rather than in one factory, the company selling the finished product needs to know very little about the upstream process and doesn't ask. As consumers, our same incentive is to not challenge the story, and this applies to procurement managers tasked with lowering costs as well. Governments are similarly motivated by the shipping industry and other corporate lobbyists. For example, though alarms have been raised about the possibility of terrorists smuggling a nuclear weapon into the United States on a container ship, it is virtually impossible to scan the 25 million containers that arrive each year because it would slow down trade. U.S. Customs and Border Protection thus relies on its Container Security Initiative, claiming that automated targeting tools, X-ray and gamma ray machines, and pre-screening in countries of origin can cover 80% of high-risk containers. This less than foolproof method leaves a generous margin for all kinds of illegal trading. Government and industry tell rosy supply chain stories about great security and not wanting to live in dread, we believe. But the fact that legitimate and illegal economies are so closely intertwined as to be indistinguishable unfolds a deeper truth. Since legality is merely the use of state power, legitimate and illegitimate trade are at bottom one and the same. As Wilhelm van Schendel and Itty Abraham write, quote, "The state's claim to a monopoly of regulated predation and redistribution of proceeds, that is, taxation and state expenditure, is based on the delegitimization of other forms of predation that are constructed as robbery, piracy, fraud, warlordism, or racketeering. But historically, the boundary of illicitness has shifted back and forth as bandits help make states and states make bandits," end quote. In other words, it's all free trade. The widespread criminality and disrespect for the democratic governance of trade that accompanied globalization was one seedbed of authoritarianism. Now that it is fully blooming in the US, logistical power will become more apparent as the technique of its particular anti-democratic oligarchy and its illegal acts. As this federal administration unilaterally levies tariffs to try to control supply chains, detains and deports workers, nationalizes portions of private corporations, suppresses free speech, and surveils its citizens, it behaves as a criminal organization. And aptly, it is led by a convicted felon. So in the talk that follows, I'll describe the logistical power of the illegal trade in drugs and counterfeits within the globalized free market, and how US protectionism and authoritarianism is now attempting to usurp that power for its own ends. So as an ordinary management science, the cocaine logistician's expertise is clever innovation rather than inspiring invention. Industry god Malcolm McLean merely noticed that the shipping container could be craned onto a truck bed to make transportation more efficient. Though the mover of cocaine fashions solutions on the fly, he is still optimizing his supply chain's efficiency to amass wealth. Sistematista in Italian, Dr. Travel in English narco slang, he must innovate continually because his technique for smuggling can only be used a few times before the police catch on. Each time he gets the goods past the authorities, he feels an inebriating buzz and yearns to shout out, "Coronamos, we won." As investigative journalist Roberto Saviano notes, quote, "No business in the world is so dynamic, so relentlessly innovative, so loyal to the pure free market spirit as the global cocaine business." Unquote. As he documents, wax pineapples, children's books, canned asparagus, moisturizer balloons, and artificial breasts and buttocks are only a few of the items in which cocaine has been smuggled. Quote Saviano, "Cocaine ultimately was no different to any other franchise, except in the scale of its profitability. An investment in $1 in the production of cocaine gives a return of $1,000 at the other end of the distribution chain. Never in human history has there been such a profitable commodity, end quote. Innovation, logistical prowess, enormous returns, and deadly violence converge in a commodity that promises pure energy and a sense of personal power. The cocaine industry intensified in the 80s in sync with globalization's naked greed. Discourses about cocaine make it into a universal equivalent, able to turn into anything at all. Rostello's narrator hides it in marble, granite, wood, glass, and parquet flooring. He even imbues blue jeans with coca paste. Quote, when it arrives, you soak the jeans. The paste floats up to the surface. You dry it out and treat it with acetone. Hey, presto, end quote. Liquid cocaine is yet more insidious. Saturating many materials and dissolving in other liquids without adding weight, it has been smuggled on the surfaces of canvases and diplomas, and within shampoo, cough syrup, pesticides, coconut milk, and perhaps most appropriately, bottles of Coca-Cola. Liquid cocaine is the perfect metaphor for the disorienting welter of consumer goods and the liquid capital of financialization. Early cultural criticism of globalization emphasized its depthless, pastiche-like quality, in Frederick Jameson's words, like surrealism without the unconscious. By now, it is the condition of everyday consumer life to which we are all accustomed, the constant, often incongruous flow of advertising images meant to be fleetingly recognized and not deeply internalized within our psyches. But the logistical aspect of consumerism has a much longer history. As Virginia Woolf described the sensation of logistical power at the London docks in the 1930s, quote, it is we, our tastes, our fashions, our needs, that make the cranes dip and swing, that call the ships from the sea. We demand shoes, furs, bags, stoves, oil, rice puddings, candles, and they are brought to us. One feels an important, a complex, a necessary animal as one stands on the quayside watching the cranes hoist this barrel, that crate, that other bale from the holds of ships that have come to anchor, end quote. So this logistical spectacle massages the consumer's self-importance, helping them overlook the fact that they are optimizing others' capital. The massive technical infrastructure, the outsized cranes, ships, containers, and ports, obtains legitimacy as a reflection of the state and corporate logistical power to move material. The presence of contraband as a parasite on legitimate cargo only confirms this power to optimize capital by structuring supply. In this context, McLean's famous innovation of container shipping after the Vietnam War accentuated the equivalence of increasingly homogeneous goods. Now, in the age of e-commerce, it matters less and less what's actually there as long as something arrives. This suggests a critical shift from commodity fetishism, the overwrought attention to the specific commodity's sensual features, to convenience, the perfection of its delivery at the right time and place. In other words, logistics. Okay. Accordingly, e-commerce revolutionized the distribution of illegal drugs. The glamour of the dark web and its silk road of drugs has been overstated, dwarfed in reality by the tremendous volume moving through the clear web. None of the drug crises that swept this country in the 21st century depended on the dark web. Neither the prescription opioid epidemic that raged in the first decade, nor the heroin of the early and mid-2010s, nor the fentanyl and synthetic opioid abuse that exploded around 2016. Rather, mundane online shipping created unstoppable supply chains for cheap and lethal chemicals. On the clear web, consumers could buy fentanyl made in Chinese labs and receive it through the US Postal Service, FedEx, DHL, and UPS. They could also manufacture fentanyl at home and distribute it locally for as little as $2 for a 100 to 400 microgram patch. Under US pressure, China banned fentanyl production in 2019, but labs pivoted to making its precursors, and overdose deaths continue to increase. Drug logisticians also evaded the increased scrutiny of Chinese shipments to the US by routing materials to Mexican firms, which processed, packaged, and smuggled them across the border. These organizations diversified their sourcing, developing ties to Indian and Nigerian synthetic opioid factories, and demonstrating the flexibility that professional supply chain management prizes. Currently, Chinese firms are using the same methods to make nitazines, the primary ingredient in street drugs known as pink cocaine, Tusi in Latin America, and Kush in West Africa. By encouraging synthetics, e-commerce on the ordinary internet created this sea change in the long modern history of illegal drug economies. Cocaine and heroin require agricultural operations with their slow seasonal pace and labor-intensive processing of coca leaves and poppies. Coca was grown for 8,000 years in the mountains of Bolivia, a history on which the grassroots movement of indigenous cocaleros in the mid-aughts drew for inspiration when cultivating coca in conjunction with the socialist movement. Large-scale cultivation in the cartel era of the 70s and 80s involved plantations and employed farmers, pickers, and packagers. By contrast, labs can make drugs year-round at lower cost and higher potency. No farmland needed, no pesticides, no harvesting, no seasons, no irrigation, writes one expert. In 2022, the Afghan Taliban banned poppy farming, cutting off the source of 90% of global heroin and further incentivizing its replacement by synthetics. Fentanyl's increased power made it 20 times more lucrative than heroin, and the new nitazines can be 40% more potent than fentanyl, which means that trace amounts can cause overdoses. Fentanyl could have replaced the entire annual US heroin market, 45 metric tons, with only 18,000 1-kilogram parcels, each costing less than $10 to ship. The US made this possible in 2011 by streamlining and lessening the postage on Chinese parcels weighing less than 1 kilogram to encourage e-commerce. Direct mail obviates complicated smuggling operations involving container ships, narco subs, and pangas. Chinese fentanyl represents a fundamental shift in the nature of drug distribution. In contrast to the monumental spectacle of container shipping infrastructure, its form of logistical power works more privately and secretively through the addressability of its users. An effect of the modern postal network, addressability confers social legitimacy on those who possess homes and digital coordinates where they can be reached. In retail delivery, it extends and intensifies Wolf's feeling of standing on the dock observing the goods, because the powerful thrill is that the special commodity has come not just to the port, but to you. In the case of at-home or other small-scale drug manufacturers, it leverages the privacy of postal communication for trade. The elimination of the de minimis import tax is upending these drug logistics and threatening a host of other small and medium-sized US-based businesses. Large retailers such as Temu and Shein were able to open warehouses in the US and shift production to countries with lower tariffs than China. Other businesses turned to fraudulent practices, mislabeling shipments or transshipping them through countries with lower tariffs. As with nitazines, xylazine, and medetomidine, drug sellers can also always turn to more potent, less regulated substances such as animal sedatives. It is precisely the lack of transparency and the nimbleness of supply chains central to globalization that will keep drugs flowing. Since tariffs cannot distinguish shipments of drugs from other small, cheap items like water bottles or slippers, legitimate businesses and economies are damaged to control illegitimate ones, once again demonstrating the leveling power of logistics. The trade in counterfeits also demonstrates logistics' power to entwine legal and illegal markets. Take Louis Vuitton's iconic logo of interlocking LVs, diamonds, stars, and flowers, which protects the fabled brand's supply chain security. Vuitton's son Georges invented it in 1896 to foil imitators, an attempt to ensure that only the authentic product could move through the channels of trade. The design marries advertising and logistics. Over a century later, consumers around the world still scrutinize it closely to discern the real thing from the fake. While the design on the apparel surface, the logo or brand, can be legally protected, fashion designs themselves have long been uncopyrightable because clothing serves a common utilitarian function. The rule encourages continuous aesthetic innovation, a euphemism for constant product turnover. In the era of globalization's enhanced logistics, it led to fast fashion. Companies such as Zara and H&M quickly and cheaply recreated the runway looks of elite houses like Gucci and Yves Saint Laurent. While imitation is the general rule of fashion, counterfeiting is the more specific phenomenon of passing off substandard products as if they were the authentic issues of the storied brand. Both fashion and counterfeiting rely on the logistical power to move goods to market as quickly as possible. Driven by social media and enhanced logistics, the two traditional seasonal collections, fall and spring, have multiplied to 52 annual micro-seasons as fashions change each week. This exhausting pace and volume exacerbate the problem of supply chain security that LV's monogram was designed to solve. Similar to the way drugs hide in shipments of legitimate goods, fakes circulate in the shadow of authentic brands. As in drug smuggling, the legit brand's profits are too high to incentivize the slowdowns required to eliminate their movement. Mass luxury is a contradiction in terms, and it ratchets up the tension logistical prowess creates between the authentic products, called auths, and counterfeits. The new category of luxury, goods so desirable that higher prices increase demand, flouting basic economic laws, began with Dior's new look of the 1950s and applied to products crafted in France or Italy. Pursuing the middle-class disposable income emerging across the global north and China in the first years of the millennium, luxury apparel brands extended their networks of stores, multiplied entry-level products such as perfume and small handbags, and amplified the now ubiquitous logos that encouraged brand recognition. High demand encouraged independent entrepreneurs to produce both imitative designs and counterfeit ones. In Guangzhou, counterfeit workshops move every 2 weeks. Completed orders are left in neutral places and picked up by local transporters with bicycles and carts. They deliver them to wholesalers in Xinjiang, who transfer them to international shipping agents who can then stash them inside containers disguised by legitimately manufactured clothing. Sometimes clothes are shipped without labels and assembled or finished by undocumented workers at the destination point. Like drug smuggling, these are complicated logistical operations designed to evade laws, in this case, those of intellectual property. Counterfeits are not the only legal problem mass luxury created. Fraud is another. To make billions selling handbags, the elite brands expanded production beyond their home workshops, and around 2005, some began manufacturing in China. To protect their value, they had to both document that fact and conceal it, and as a result, bags actually made in China instead bear tags stating that they are made in Italy, France, or the UK. For others, various tricks avoid or hide the Made in China label. For example, manufacturing the bag in China but attaching the handle in Italy, or making the upper part of the shoe in China and then affixing the sole in Italy. A sizable Chinese community of workers makes bags, shoes, and clothes in Prato, Italy, at a fraction of the wages of Italian workers. The labels whisper brief, deceptive supply chain stories. Just like fakes, so-called legitimate productions are logistical operations designed to game international trade laws. For some goods, the same factory makes both the genuine article and the fake version. In a global economy that makes goods on the move, all that really matters is the logistical power to get them first to market. In the fake economy, social media operates as logistical media, moving the goods. A 2021 estimate suggested that more than 1 in 10 Instagram posts were by counterfeiters who had 20 million followers and other users within their reach. And I'm sure that in the intervening 4 years, that number has only gone up. The platform's stories feature is popular because posts disappear after 24 hours, reducing the risk of ejection from the platform if it discovers the forbidden activity. Pandemic shopping combined with Facebook's and TikTok's transformation into retail platforms intensified the vending of fakes. Social media moves shoes, apparel, and makeup from factories in China and Russia onto North American and European feet, backs, and faces. It's assisted by WeChat and WhatsApp, where the majority of communication with sellers takes place, PayPal, which transfers the money, and DHL, which recently surpassed EMS, a service of the state-owned China Post, as the world's leading deliverer of counterfeit goods. As with drugs, nothing demonstrates the entanglement of legitimate and criminal economies better than their shared logistical means. The meta conglomerate piously laments counterfeit selling on its platforms, even though fakes drive much of its traffic and generate significant revenue. This is how social media equivocates about its considerable logistical power to move illicit goods. Now, not only our shoes and our handbags, but our knives, makeup, phone chargers, and medications, our oven mitts and bike helmets and airplane parts, the semiconductors and intravenous drip machines, defibrillators, the brakes of high-speed trains, all of these things can be counterfeit. Even before the pandemic-era semiconductor shortage brought a flood of counterfeit chips to the market, online shopping had ushered in a new era of indiscernible fake products across the full range of consumption, not just retail, but wholesale, public sector, and military. Fake products began to proliferate on Amazon in 2018, the year in which third-party sales on its platform had increased to 160 billion. Fake reviews sprang up to support them, spurring a web service, Review Meta, to review the reviews. Fast forward to 2025. In June, an aeronautics industry group lobbied the Trump administration to rescind tariffs on the argument that they will encourage more counterfeit airplane parts to enter supply chains. Already in the spring, Chinese counterfeit manufacturers increased direct-to-consumer social media advertising for an array of goods to avoid the depressed sales expected from the proposed 145% tariff. In an inflationary period, sales of cheaper counterfeits are expected to explode. As with drugs, logistics embeds the counterfeit market within the legitimate economy, blending the two until it's impossible, and sometimes undesirable, to distinguish the parasite from the host. And as with drugs, those who will pay the price for unsecured supply chains for goods like airplane parts and train brakes are consumers and workers. Now, I want to turn from the problems to the potential solutions. Could much hyped new tools for making supply chains transparent stem this deluge of counterfeit products? Blockchain, AI, and quantum computing have all been hyped as ways to see the tiers of complex globalized supply chains. I'll just remind you in case you've forgotten, because it's been a few years since this was hyped, but blockchain is a decentralized documentary technology made up of blocks of coded information that are linked together in an immutable chain. Its trustworthiness derives from the solidity of the links. Once a block has been recorded, it cannot be altered, thus verifying all the preceding blocks. Since each block contains a cryptographic hash of the previous one, a timestamp, and transaction data, the chain gets longer, which is why its energy use is so intense, but it remains unchangeable. The idea of linking each block of a code to a leg of a goods journey could authenticate supply chains, streamlining the flow of goods and eliminating the trade in fakes, as well as other expensive forms of loss and friction. Artificial intelligence is the use of computer systems to perform tasks that normally depend on human capabilities, such as learning, reasoning, problem solving, perception, and decision making. When AI works with blockchain-verified data, it is thought to accurately forecast demand, reducing overproduction and unnecessary transportation, and enhancing inventory management. In food supply chains, AI combines with Internet of Things sensors to monitor temperature and humidity in real time, reducing inventory loss. Further, by processing data from invoices, purchase orders, and payment histories, AI can find anomalies in transaction patterns, detecting fraudulent activities such as duplicate invoices in real time, and safeguarding the integrity of the chain. Finally, when linked to satellite and drone images, AI can automate surveillance of the so-called first mile of the supply chain, the remote upstream places where the most exploited workers extract raw materials or perform rudimentary assembly tasks. Such monitoring is said to reduce risk by producing something called ground truth, verified data on what is actually happening. Many of the same claims for AI are made for the emerging technology of quantum computing, which processes data in the quantum states of subatomic particles, making it faster. When it becomes commercially available, quantum computing will, the speed of it will supposedly streamline supply chains by responding effectively to disruptions in real time. What does all of this look like? One early example of blockchain for supply chains was Chinese company Lianmo Technology's Go-Go Chicken project, whose QR codes opened a page with details about the chicken's life, including its weight, the number of steps it took, and its photograph. The steps were monitored by special chicken Fitbits. If, after getting to know the chicken, you still wanted to eat it, you could do so without anxiety over microbes, hormones, and maltreatment. In this way, supply chain transparency was thought to reduce decision-making and enhance consumption. In terms of counterfeits, since no material or good could move without being verified, any shipped good would be real. Moreover, by regulating first-mile subcontractors, it realized this fantasy could end not only smuggling, but labor and environmental exploitation. But an equivocation underlies this dream of supply chain transparency in the malleable concept of disruption. The three technologies are hyped for being able to pinpoint, predict, and quickly respond to supply chain disruptions, which include weather, less predictable due to climate crises, shifts in consumer demand, fickler in the age of social media, and politics, more volatile in authoritarian oligarchies. But the surest way to eliminate those disruptions, ameliorate climate crises by turning to renewables, build real-life communities instead of social media platforms, ensure that resources are democratically managed, all these are too expensive and collaborative to undertake. So the technologies concede chaos and merely hope to manage it. They actually feed on disruption. Here is the true Ouroboros of our phase of capitalism, manufacturing uncertainty and disaster in order to sell their mitigation. As Aris Comparazos Athanasio describes the ethos of big tech, quote, "It embeds uncertainty within complex and opaque platforms," end quote. Private permissioned blockchains are not transparent and accessible to the public, only to the stakeholders in the deal. They also require more computing power to check than most people can access. BMW, for example, seeks to control its supply chain story to avoid scandals such as the 2016 revelation that Indian children were laboring in debt bondage to mine the mica used for the car's shimmery paint. The same control might eliminate counterfeit components, but consumers would have to take BMW's word for it. In theory, since the car comes into being through the documentation of its moving manufacture, it cannot differ from its blockchain story. In reality, the company could offer any evidence it chose to the public or other body of oversight. Since companies require first mile exploitation, such as child labor, to turn profits, no one really wants to see the whole supply chain. In this context, authentic disruption would be a sustained, collaborative global commitment to labor equity and environmental respect. Two recent failed examples of supply chain surveillance, the supply chain surveillance fantasy, expose its bad faith. In 2018, shipping giant Maersk announced its blockchain-based joint venture with IBM, the TradeLens Consortium, which took 4 years to conclude its first end-to-end paperless financial transaction. 5 years afterwards, Maersk shut down the program, having failed to reach full global industry participation. Since efforts to achieve transparency at scale shrink the large loopholes through which smugglers move goods, not to mention creating administrative costs for legitimate shippers, the logistics industry cannot regulate itself. Likewise, Walmart, famous for coercing its grocery suppliers, attempted a similar program in 2018, but by 2022 could only reliably trace leafy greens and peppers at scale. The small and medium-sized farmers and growers who supplied the retail behemoth lacked the development funds and know-how to implement it. Moreover, working with their local middlemen to move crops from fields to warehouses was cheaper than integrating into a tech platform and applying for credit from global banks. Many of their operations are not digitized. As a story of disappointed expectations, blockchain for supply chain transparency suggests the distance between high-tech and everyday analog life, financialized capitalist abstraction and the earthiness of growing plants and soil, the dream of totalizing logistical control, and the reality that the global economy cannot be fully managed. The failures of these technologies and possible promises remind us that logistical power runs smoothly when businesses and consumers alike ignore supply chain stories that feature workers and the environment. This willful ignorance permits violations of law to attend production and distribution. So to begin to conclude, my argument that logistical power is a structural feature of capitalism that entangles legitimate and illegitimate markets helps explain the emergence of oligarchic authoritarianism in the US in 2025. It extends the tacit labor and environmental crimes of globalized production and distribution into the absolute lawlessness of fascism, a sweeping grab for control of supply chains, territory, and laboring populations. Historically, since laws regulate commercial exchanges, logistical power has been a capitalist technique that the state permits as a matter of form. Now that this largely empty ritual has been set aside, the state can openly pursue its oligarch cronies without all the subterfuge and red tape. The criminal gang that took over the US government in 2025 is more brazen than any of its predecessors. Rather than middle managers across the board cooking the books to evade tariffs and regulations, their organization CEOs must line up at the White House with checkbooks in hand to plead for exemptions. The executive branch unilaterally and selectively imposes tariffs, a set of unconstitutional acts that flouts all semblance of free and fair competition. Companies such as Apple, NVIDIA, AMD, MP Materials, and Lithium Americas are rewarded with tariff exemptions as long as they profit share with the US government. This new but old mode of state criminality resembles the joint stock monopolies of the 16th and 17th centuries. So to be clear, I'm not arguing for a return to free trade and policies of neoliberalism. Since corporations have always collaborated with the government, the novelty of authoritarian criminality lies less in the violation of corporate rights than in the transgression of any semblance of democratic oversight and shared governance across the branches of government. So perhaps in another paper I can theorize the semblance as an alibi of power. It was not good enough, but I miss it now that it's gone. As in the mercantilism of yore, we should expect a return to smuggling by the many medium and small traders unprotected by the state's favoritism. As the power of logistics to efficiently and legally move goods is restricted to fewer people, more will turn to extra-legal means, mirroring the state example. Of course, the horizon of this state control of industrial policy is the bolstering of national security by reducing dependence on trade with China, which controls 70% of the world's critical minerals. In this trade war, we see a bellwether of a key feature of logistical power, its easy pivot from commerce to armed conflict. So this is where logistics, as like a management science, overlaps with military logistics. The Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 17th century, the 7 Years' War of the 18th century, the Opium Wars of the 19th, the Gulf and Iraq wars at the turn of the 21st century all escalated from commercial efforts to keep markets open and supply chains flowing. The US administration's extrajudicial killings of Venezuelans and Colombians on small boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific, clear violations of international law that verge on warfare, are further examples of the authoritarian state's efforts to forcibly control supply chains, which Project 2025 designates as a national security objective of, quote, re-hemisphering, or reestablishing US imperial dominance in Latin America. How does capitalism change from one phase to the next? For Giovanni Arrighi, some feature of the previous phase that had once been a generative innovation becomes a liability. For example, the colonies that gave the British Empire captive markets, edging out the Dutch, eventually became too expensive to maintain. Once fused with the East Asian informal networking model, the US's vaunted corporate organizational prowess began to generate more wealth for internal and global elites, weakening its own human resources. But one aspect of capitalism has not changed through these phases: the power of logistics to move goods to markets, affecting exchanges and turning over capital for new investment. As I've demonstrated, it's a power that fuses legal and illegal markets, revealing states' toleration of and participation in criminality, and articulating the steep challenge to democratic resource management. In the mid-1990s, Arrighi predicted 3 possible outcomes for the world order after the end of the US phase: East Asian dominance, a world empire, or endless chaos. As Luis Navia's badass motherfucking killers become ever more indistinguishable from the guys who just get shit from point A to point B, how we reassert democratic control over supply chains may determine which of these becomes our fate. Thank you.
I'm going to thank you for your talk, and very far-reaching and sobering on this election day. And I'm going to also have a logistical interruption for a minute.
Okay.
To let you take a seat. I'm Nancy Lutkehouse. I've been directing the Sites of Inquiry, or a group that Otto is a member of, and want to suggest, if this is all right with you, that we have a little bit of movement of people and goods, so that if you have to leave, we'll understand before the discussion. We also have coffee and water and some food in the back. So if you're willing to invite a little chaos while you take your questions, I'll let you back up.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm happy.
Would you like me to bring you some water?
No, thank you. I'm good. I've got some. Yeah, thanks. Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure. No, I love the, I'm glad we're right, and I love the breakfast at Tiffany's vibe of like the small apartment with the big party.
Well, we had no idea this was the first time we've been doing this kind of public
Oh, okay.
of our group, so.
So usually it's just like the fifth of you.
Yeah, sitting around the table here, so it's a very good spot. But I think that for those of you who are able to remain, if you have questions, I'm going to let you take them. And so, a moment of silence.
I already saw a hand.
Okay, there was a hand.
I thought so. I was like,
I have a question, so I didn't bring it, but,
I think so, go for it.
we read part of your book, last week in the Society of Fellows meeting, and I was really interested in the larger, arguments. And then after discussing your book, I watched Catherine Biegel's new movie, House of Dynamite.
Oh, yeah.
Which came to Netflix. And I don't know if you know anything about it, but it's essentially a thriller about a nuclear attack that is missing all of the actual political context. It's just about the movement of the bomb and then like a lengthy Zoom meeting to decide what to do about the bomb. So it's basically about the logistics of what to do with these things moving through space. And it's getting pretty poor reviews because I think it doesn't have this like thing that we can hold on to. And so I guess this leads me to a question, like in the 21st century, as we're facing this ever complexifying field of logistics, like how do we tell those stories? And do you see this like problem of narrativizing logistics? Did you face that in your book, and do you see that as something we're going to be grappling with a lot in the 21st century?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Who else has seen that movie? Yeah, it's like, I love Catherine Bigelow, but like this is really like not a good movie. So
Very weird.
yeah, and I think your analysis is spot on, that it's kind of critiquing the bureaucratic like and technical administration of coping with defending against a nuclear attack without any of the politics, right? So this is kind of the reason I wrote the book, was because when you look at logistics as a management science, it's absolutely like depoliticized and dehumanized. And when I say dehumanized, I mean both that it's increasingly automated and also that it really stands in a fundamental way against the human workers who deploy it. So my goal is to try to tell what I'm calling supply chain stories, which is to bring humans and the environment kind of back into the equation, right? Because logistics moves things from A to B. It regards the space that it moves through as blank, right? But of course, people live in those spaces, and there are actual like organic environments as well. So how do we tell the story of the movement of goods, people, and information is something that is inherently human and also like deeply political. That's what I kind of wanted to take on in the project. So yeah, I think, how do you do that? Like you kind of tell a lot of random stories, and we were just talking about in the graduate seminar how like I had to sort of be comprehensive, but also like some of the examples, like a lot of the examples could be swapped out for another example because the material is endless. So.
I'll follow up and then go sort of from front to back. So you have this concept of logistical power, and in the talk you talk about the logic of the system that, in the end you say, well, this logic has remained, this logic to move goods to market, to turn over capital, has remained more or less consistent, even as other features of capitalism have changed. And so I guess my question is about the agency in this story. Like exactly what is this? What's the logic? Who's the mover that makes this logistical system work, right? Because it sounds to me a little bit like you're talking about the logic of capital, right? And that kind of, put it like that, I have some resistance to this because my immediate instinct is to say, well, the logic of which capital, right? Because, you take a supply chain that involves, like, let's say moving raw materials from like rare earths from the DRC into a production factory in China that produces iPhones designed by the United States that are then sold in Sweden, right? All these 4 locations have very different kinds of capitalism and very different kinds of logics of capital. So how do you think about that? Like because there's a way you can narrate the story, right? That is like, this is a series of contradicting logics that are kind of working themselves out to produce something that looks like a supply chain, but maybe it's not an overarching logic. So I'm thinking about, how do you think about agency and who's in the driver's seat of this supply? Who holds the supply power?
Mm-hmm. So I think that, in that example, you'd have to break down who are all the parties to the deal, right? I'm sure there's like, at least several dozen players there, right? And so it's a decentralized kind of operation. So I don't think that the modalities of capital are different. I think they're actually perfectly united by the supply chain. But they are allocated and understood differently, slightly differently in different places. So, the agents are the people who are going to make their return on that money. The consumers who might buy the end product, the laborers at every point in the transfer have some agency. I would like them to have more. If they could collectivize, they would have more. But yeah, and so I'm sort of, the challenge of this project is to take something big and anonymous and multifarious and complicated, like a supply chain, and render it into a narrative that, I was just sort of telling the students that narrative has three components, plot, character, and setting. So, for anything that is part of a supply chain, you can actually map that, right? And you can bring that about. And so telling the story gives it a kind of human and organic quality that is the antithesis of the professional logistical mindset, which is how do we optimize capital and move it by moving it around. So, agency is sort of, we kind of have to look for it, and we have to find it in different places. And so that's the challenge in front of us and in front of me.
Sure. Your questions are always better than mine, though. I had a great opportunity recently to be in Belfast, and I talked with some people in Northern Ireland who were incredibly nostalgic for the days pre-Brexit of being able to smuggle things across the border. And I'm wondering, and especially thinking of your story with this gentleman too, of the dopamine hit of, we won, we did it, we beat the system. And I'm loving the idea of dehumanization and rehumanizing the idea of supply chains, logistics, and things. And I'm curious if we need to think about rewriting history, not just for the systems that are involved, the capital, the structures, the tariffs, the making money, and also think a little bit about the personal investiture that goes into this of gaming a system, seeing a system, finding cracks, and then winning and getting that dopamine hit.
Yeah.
But that kind of goes back to your humanization of history too, which I'd love to hear more about.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's an important quality of the human that I'm sort of trying to promote that as the softer, gentler side of things. But it also includes, somewhat despicable qualities as well. Like the notion of, it's not necessarily despicable to feel great that you gamed a system, but if you're hurting people to make money, then yes, it is despicable. So, smugglers have that exhilarating rush, drug smugglers and smugglers of other things, counterfeiters. I mean, the affect that I now link that to in our moment is, the sense of we won and we're sticking it to the system and we're breaking it is now, the authoritarian oligarchic mindset and feeling. They love that they're withholding nutritional assistance from people right now. That gives them a thrill. That's their coronamos, So, the thing about logistics and opposition to it, and this goes back to this question of agency, it's not a simple story with clear-cut heroes and villains, right? Yes, drug smugglers and authoritarians are obviously the villains, right? But, how to resist them, they're still human, right? And how to resist them from a human and ethical standpoint, it's all a big series of questions to try to figure out. So, but I like this, your point about small-scale smuggling across borders, that, that's a local example of something that changes, that people have to adjust to when, the politics that are distant, perhaps, from Belfast, kind of come in and hinge on it.
And if I could do just a quick follow-up on that too, the ethics around that is fascinating, and the idea of just ignoring ethics to do the thing. And I'm wondering, I know that there have been some pushbacks, equal trade, organics, fair trade, ideas of community support, community supported agriculture, to so many different iterations of that, where it's the demander that is influencing the supplier in some ways. And I'm curious if the ethics around this, if you're seeing that there's also pushback at the same time and through some of those channels. And I'm sorry to take away from you.
Oh, if you mean, so is there pushback like in what you're describing, like community gardens or like local production? Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's the thing about scale, right? Is that scaling up is always like the capitalist gesture, okay? For the other side, for Marxists, when they scale up, it's to revolution. But like, you know, figuring out the formula for revolution is kind of like notoriously difficult. The whole point is that you don't see it coming, right? So we don't really know what confluence of politics are going to wind up with that. But I think, you know, it sort of comes out of the ethical consumerism that you're describing, but it also pushes back a little bit against it because ethical consumerism is, you know, it's hard to kind of produce a lot of serious change that way. A lot of it is hard to calculate. You know, poor consumers have the least means to, you know, consume ethically. And so how do we do it? You know, I think it has to be like, I don't know, I don't have an answer, but it has to be like kind of local, ad hoc, and then we'll see what happens, if it can be institutionalized or not.
Thank you for the talk, and I have two questions. One of them is something that comes out of the talk, and the other question, second one is what we read together, the things that Professor Arrow circulated a week before. The first question is question about the flattening that happens with logistics, one of the arguments that you're making here. And I was reminded here of, of course, the capital volume 1 MCM. And I say that because the basis of Marxist reading that is precisely that for capital to function, there has to be, first of all, abstraction, and second of all, flattening that has to go into abstraction, and that's why you can use someone a paper and then they will give you a shelter, right? And so I was wondering if there is something else when you make the argument about the flattening that happens with logistics. Is there something else beyond this kind of MCM transaction that has to happen? Because that flattening was kind of not only inherent but very much fundamental to the working of capital itself. So that's the first question.
Okay.
And the second question is very brief. At the end of chapter 5 that we read together, you draw your argument towards degrowth and the current kind of formation or one of the responses from this leftist idea of degrowth economics. And I was wondering, and this is maybe a little bit of provocation, but it seems to me that it's degrowth that flattens up the thing. It's degrowth who forgets about ideology, who forgets about ideological critique, and so on. So that's the.
Oh, okay. You're saying that degrowth is itself an ideology that it's flattening, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, that seems fair enough to me, but you know, I also think that there's a serious critique of growth to be made. You know, that kind of cuts to the heart of logistics, right? Because I would think this would not be as urgent an argument in a previous era of history when the scale of logistics was smaller, and when we didn't have like what I'm talking about in this talk, where you know, the assembly of products is so globally distributed. So this kind of touches on your first question that has to do with Marx. I'm not a huge Marxist theorist, but you know, I will say that I think the thing that has changed since Marx is is that fundamentally distribution and production are linked. So, you know, Marx doesn't, in volume 2, he like says some things that could be related to logistics. But I think that, you know, really it's this notion that, yeah, that's fine. You know, like the BMW makes a car by like moving, you know, assembling the crankshaft in like France, and then like it goes to Germany and somebody like installs it in the chassis and like whatever, you know, and it moves all around, right? And so that, I think that you know, it's still capital, right? And it's still MCM, but like it kind of expands the scene of it in a way. So what I want to do is both draw attention to the distribution and to logistics, but also like point out that it is connected to production, and that logistics is inside the factory, and you know, the factory is not like one building in one place anymore. So One thing I could point to, if you want like a theoretical discussion, is to think maybe about Derrida's specters of Marx. Derrida is talking about the supernatural language that he sees in Marx's theory. I would say that he talks about the dancing table, right? Or so the commodity, he uses the language of like the commodity stands forth or steps forth or appears, right? And so we could use that moment or that language to think about logistics as the stuff that's happening like around the commodity and the fetish, so that it's not anymore like, oh, here's the shirt, right? And it's the material manifestation of social relations, but there's all this other movement for the shirt to appear in a place at a time, right? And so that's just bringing logistics more into the Marxist conversation. Sure.
Good. Yeah, sure. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting to me. I'm curious about, you make them kind of this equation between companies today and joint stock companies. I guess that's more of a clarifying question. Do you think of them as the shipping companies, then the shipping agents that kind of represent these, or is it the examples you give, like Apple, that looks a lot more like a joint stock company because they rely upon these shippers? And I guess the kind of second question I have is about this re-democratization. I mean, you kind of suggest that this is done through collectivization, but I think the other way that there have been attempts to do this is through the internationalization of maritime law and maritime kind of jurisdiction over supply chains. But yet I see the obvious criticism that that has led to kind of the system and components we have now. Would that be something that you're thinking about as a way to re-democratize it, or is it something much more from kind of workers and the ground level that you're thinking about?
I mean, like I'm kind of doing the rude thing of like identifying a problem and withholding a solution. But I can say that, I mean, to me, when I think about Arrighi's models, it felt like there was a moment, or there could have been a moment, and maybe there can still be a moment where we have like a kind of, more international agreement, and more of an international focus and project related to the climate crisis. And so if there could be international consensus around something like that, that could be like a kind of world-making project where we could, unite like disparate populations and cultures and interests like around, a single thing that would be like focused on human and environmental flourishing. Is that possible? I don't know. The other thing you're talking about, we mentioned briefly in the class before this talk, was the problems of organizing around the supply chain, right? And so when you have, that's been the classical problem for critical logistics studies, is how do you organize when the distribution is so dispersed, right? I feel like there are opportunities for that and against it. One thing is that, let's say Amazon, for example, is like a global company, although it's not everywhere. It's not dominant in the Far East, for example. But there are workers, and yet it's the workers at the locations, right, who, have their own, it's important that they're in a particular fulfillment center. So we're at a place where they use the same language even, they say that we're not robots, and they say that in Spanish and Italian and English and everything else, right? So, but they're still organizing themselves, without talking to each other. There is some conversation. For example, there are certain, they try to strike on the same days, for example. So that's the question. How do we, I don't have the answer to, but I feel like there's classical Marxism is going to look for answers like that. And I in the book, all I suggest is counter logistics as a more ad hoc, diffuse kind of improvisatory thing that anyone can try to take up. And I'm purposely kind of letting it be vague and open and permeable. So.
Sean, you had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering your thoughts on sort of the inverse of smuggling as a way to provide humanitarian aid towards authoritarian regimes. So personally, I've had experiences actually having to I do a tech startup that ships technology, and one of the countries we have a pilot program in is South Sudan, and we've had to literally bribe people at the border to get in our ed tech technology. before partnering with UNESCO. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that, where it has the inverse effect, where it's not necessarily directly bringing some sort of like greater evil to society or net negative, but really trying to combat some sort of authoritarianism.
I mean, this sounds really interesting, so I would love to talk to you more about it. But I guess my question is, like, is it a startup? Is it a nonprofit? Like, I would want to learn more about what you're doing.
Yeah, or the other instance I can think of as an example is like in North Korea, like people who are trying to defect from North Korea have to smuggle in certain items to help them escape, like a cell phone or a sat phone or whatever. So things like that where it's used to help people escape. So like, is this sort of like a necessary evil, like keeping logistics and the loopholes around them in place to actually squash authoritarianism in some instances?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, that's a great question. I would say that it's more like fighting fires, right? So counter logistics, right? Trying to like resist logistics, it's in specific situations like this. So if you're smuggling in the needed things for defectors, or you're smuggling this technology for people to try to use, and you're not like expecting payment from them, you know, those are counter logistical projects because they're not about accruing and accumulating capital. Now, like another example, like if I go down with this group that hands out supplies in MacArthur Park, right? We're giving away pallets of Gatorade to people. It's a corporate product. Like somebody donated it, but like it was, you know, it's connected to capitalism in like a very obvious way. You know, that can't be helped, but like the effort is you know, is counter logistical. So it's, you know, you can't like kind of separate yourself from the capitalist economy. And so, you know, it's very much entangled. This is not a world of absolutes and like purity, and, you know, we have to work within the materials and the systems that are available to us. So anyway, your project sounds interesting. I'd love to hear more.
Nancy, you had your hand.
Oh, I was really just sort of a follow-up comment on the earlier discussion about the counter logistics and thinking about, on the one hand, James Scott's work on weapons of the weak, the ways in which peasants undermine, you know, the plantation owners and whatever, by gleaning and stealing. My point really is that I understand the desire to scale up and figure out large-scale things to do, but maybe some of what's going to be the most valuable is given, you know, as you said, we can't separate ourselves out from these, is what each little local area, you know, works on and does is appropriate, so that and you're not bemoaning those, you know, you're actually championing them. But it seems to me that that may actually be the most effective thing in some way. That sure, it would be great if all the Amazon workers in different places communicated. At the same time, it may not, if they simply figure out in their own local areas what to do, that may be the way to go, as opposed to worrying about them all, you know, coordinating something.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's all.
Exactly, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we're intellectuals. We want to like solve it and figure it out conclusively, right? But we always are in a state of waiting to sort of see what unfolds. So to take like the No Kings protests from a couple of weeks ago, like it's an important logistical moment when there are so many people in the street, right? People gathering in a way that they don't usually do. And what's really important about the way that happened, and what I take hope from, is that in every location where it happened, the number of people protesting out in the street outnumbered the available local police force. That's strategically important because if, you know, and maybe something will build on that eventually, right? But that's the way that we show that, you know, we have a counter, we can counter what is coming at us. We don't know how, you know, I'll be curious to find out what happens.
Wonder?
Thank you for your thoughts, Susan. I have this question about like this distinction between the concept of flow and the concept of chain. And like I was just wondering when I read, mean, I only read 2 chapters, introduction and chapter 5, but like I was wondering, like whether logisticians, like what kind of distinctions that logisticians or their interlocutors make distinctions between these 2 concepts. Because flow, like, it's like a concept that always, like flow always like denies, like the surfaces through which the movements happen, or like sometimes it also denies like the destruction that the movements make, as you mentioned in your talk. Like, yeah, I was just wondering this, like, whether they are making those distinctions, or like, or how are you making that distinction between flow and change?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that like, I'm not sure exactly how like technical logisticians will, parse that, but the way that I would talk about it is if you think about the image of a rail car, right? So it's got a single, it's united in its flow, right, as it moves along the track, but then it has these modular components, the actual boxcars, right? And so they can be switched in and out. So you can stop at one station and unhook one and rehook a different one, and it keeps going. And so that to me is like the logic that unites the chain with the flow, because it's the way that the chain can be like kind of improvisatorily, reconfigured at any moment without really compromising the movement. A good example of that like might be, a primitive kind of form of 19th century logistics. They had traveling post offices in Britain where they would put all the bags of mail onto the rail car and then have people sort it while the train was in transit. And so it's like a system that has multiple like planes of movement. But as long as it's moving, that's how they could manage to get the mail delivered, 5 times a day in some places like London. So I don't think there's a huge contradiction. Like the improvisatory quality and the innovative quality of logistics means that it always can reroute and improvise and sort of perform on the spot. So, that's why they want to have transparency and anticipate disruptions so that they have a backup and they can slot it in and they can keep going. The worst thing is to have the system go down and stay down for any like meaningful length of time, I think. You can go slower, it's not, so that's why it's not about speed. Right? Everyone's like, oh, it's speed, like everything's faster than it used to be. I don't think that's true. I don't think humans can actually live at a faster rate than they ever used to. It's just that every aspect of our daily existence has been put into motion. So it feels faster because of the aggregate, the multiplication of moving parts, if that makes sense.
Line things up, Eric?
Yeah, I'm kind of sort of there's a question that's sort of forming in my head that I'm trying to wrap myself around. But maybe I can think of this over lunch, since it's not coming together right now. But I want to thank everybody for coming. I thought it's been great to spend time with this book. A lot of us read a bunch of it last week, and then we got this opportunity to talk about it this morning with the grad students, and I'm sort of struck at how different these conversations have been in terms of the kinds of things we've been talking about, the kinds of questions people have had. So I think it really testifies to the scope and generativeness of the book. Like it can take it and like run in many different directions, which is great. Like that's what we're here for, particularly in this kind of interdisciplinary forum. So thank you everyone for coming. I want to thank the Society of Fellows in the Humanities and the History Department, as well as Anthropology and Levon and others who've sponsored this and made it possible for Susan to come. And we will keep on doing these public lectures as I hear. So stay tuned for the next one next semester. And thank you, Susan, for giving us this much food for thought.